The house stood alone. It was a Victorian mansion, dark and brooding. Its paint was peeling and its windows were like vacant eyes. The house was surrounded by a forest. The trees were gnarled and twisted. They seemed to press in on the house as if trying to suffocate it. Emily and James stood before the house. They were excited to move in. This was their dream home. They had always wanted to live in an old house. "It's perfect," Emily said. "It's a little creepy," James said. He smiled nervously. Emily laughed. "Don't be silly," she said. "It's just an old house." She took his hand and they walked up the front steps. The door creaked open as if it hadn't been used in years. Emily and James stepped inside. The air inside was cold and damp. It smelled like dust and decay. Emily and James spent the next few days unpacking. They filled the house with their belongings, but no matter how hard they tried, they could not shake the feeling that they were not alone. They heard noises at night. There were creaks and groans. They echoed through the empty halls. One night, Emily woke up suddenly. She felt a cold spot in the air next to her bed. "James," she whispered. James was sound asleep. Emily shook him awake. "What is it?" he mumbled. "I think I heard something," Emily said. James listened, but there was nothing there. "It was probably just the wind," he said. Emily tried to relax, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The next day, Emily and James were in the attic. They were looking for old furniture. "What's that?" James asked. He pointed to a corner of the attic. There was a small wooden door. It was hidden behind some boxes. Emily and James moved the boxes. They opened the door. The door creaked open, revealing a small dusty room. "What is this place?" Emily asked. The room was empty. There was a single window. It was boarded up. Emily and James walked over to the window. James pried off the boards. Light flooded into the room. Emily gasped. There was a name scratched into the wall. It said, "Help me!" Emily and James stared at the name. They felt a cold shiver run down their spines. That night the whispers started. They were soft at first. Emily and James could barely hear them, but they grew louder. They seemed to be coming from the walls. Emily and James lay in bed. They listened to the whispers. They couldn't make out what they were saying, but they sounded angry, and they sounded scared. Emily sat up in bed. "James," she whispered. "Do you hear that?" James nodded. His face was pale. "What is it?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "I don't know," she said. The whispers grew louder. Emily and James could feel the anger and fear in them. They got out of bed and went to the attic. Section 4. The Secret of the Journal. The whispers were coming from the small wooden door. Emily and James slowly opened the door. The room was dark, but they could hear the whispers more clearly now. They were coming from the corner of the room. Emily and James walked over to the corner. They found a small wooden box hidden behind some loose bricks. Emily opened the box. Inside was a leather-bound journal. Emily took the journal out of the box. She opened it up. The pages were filled with faded ink. She began to read aloud. The journal belonged to a young woman named Sarah. Sarah had lived in the house 100 years ago. She had been trapped in the small room. She had scratched the name on the wall. Emily read on. She learned that Sarah had been murdered. Sarah's ghost was haunting the house. She was the one who was whispering. Emily and James looked at each other. They were terrified. They had to do something to help Sarah. They had to put her spirit to rest. But how? Section 5. A History of Sadness. Emily and James decided to visit the local library. They hoped to find some information about Sarah and the history of the house. They spent hours poring over old books and newspapers. Finally, they found what they were looking for. There was an article about the murder of Sarah. She had been killed by her husband, a jealous and abusive man. The article said that Sarah's husband had buried her body somewhere on the property. Emily and James left the library. They were more determined than ever to help Sarah. They drove back to the house and began searching for her burial place. They searched for hours, but they couldn't find anything. Just when they were about to give up, Emily spotted something. There was a small heart-shaped locket dangling from the branches of a weeping willow tree. Emily recognized the locket from the description in the journal. It was Sarah's. Emily and James dug beneath the willow tree. They found Sarah's remains. They were buried in a shallow grave. Emily and James gently lifted Sarah's remains out of the grave. They took them back to the house. They knew that they had to give Sarah a proper burial. They buried her in the backyard. They marked her grave with a simple wooden cross. As they stood over her grave, they heard the whispers one last time, but this time the whispers were different. They were no longer angry or scared. They were peaceful, and then they were gone. Emily and James knew that Sarah was finally at peace.